The morning my son came to collect his money, he found the locks changed, my truck gone from the driveway, and a single white envelope taped to the front door. I know what happened next, because my neighbor, Carol, watched the whole thing from her kitchen window and called me afterward. She said he stood there for a long time, just staring at that envelope like he couldn't decide whether to open it. Then he did. And then he sat down on the porch steps, put his head in both hands, and didn't move for almost 20 minutes. Carol asked if she should call someone. I told her no. I told her this was exactly what was supposed to happen, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back 8 weeks, to the Sunday afternoon when everything started unraveling, and explain how a 4-year-old retired firefighter from Medford, Oregon ended up teaching his grown son the most expensive lesson of both their lives. My name is James Calloway. Most people call me Jim. I spent 31 years with the Jackson County Fire District, starting as a rookie who could barely lift the hose and finishing as a battalion chief who'd seen more than I ever wanted to see. I retired 3 years ago, mostly because my knees said enough, and partly because my wife Patricia had been diagnosed with a brain aneurysm, and we wanted time together while we still had it. We got 14 months. She passed quietly on a Tuesday morning in March, sitting in the garden she loved, a cup of coffee going cold on the table beside her. The doctors said she probably didn't feel any pain. I've chosen to believe them. Patricia and I raised our son, Tyler, in a 3-bedroom house on the south side of Medford, the same house I still lived in after she died. We gave him a good life. Not extravagant, but solid. Piano lessons, Little League, a used car when he turned 17 because he'd kept a B average like we'd agreed. Patricia was the kind of mother who baked cookies for his teachers and stayed up past midnight helping him with history papers. I coached his soccer team for 4 years, even though I worked 24-hour shifts. We showed up. We tried. That's what I told myself anyway in the quiet months after Patricia died, when I started to honestly examine the man our son had become. Tyler was 31. He'd married a woman named Amber 6 years ago at a ceremony that cost more than my first year's salary as a firefighter. They lived in a new development outside Ashland, drove 2 leased vehicles that got traded in every 3 years, and took vacations to places I'd never been able to afford when I was his age. Tyler worked as a regional sales director for a medical device company, which paid well, though apparently not well enough for the life he and Amber had decided they deserved. I noticed the signs over the years, but told myself it wasn't my business. They were adults. Adults made their own choices. It was a Sunday in late October, when Tyler called and asked if he and Amber could come over. He said it was important. His voice had that specific tightness to it, the one I'd learned to recognize over 30 years of fire service as the voice of someone who already knows the situation is bad and is bracing for it to get worse. I said, "Of course. Come for dinner. I'll make the chili Patricia always liked." They arrived at 6. Amber had a folder under her arm. Tyler was dressed like he was going to a job interview, which struck me as odd for a Sunday dinner at his father's house. We ate first. Nobody mentioned whatever they'd come to say. We talked about the weather and a hiking trail near Crater Lake that I'd been meaning to check out. Then Tyler pushed his bowl aside and looked at me the way I imagine a man looks at the ocean right before he jumps. "Dad, my restaurant is in serious trouble." I set down my spoon. "What restaurant?" Tyler had opened a farm-to-table restaurant in downtown Ashland 8 months ago. He'd mentioned it once in passing during one of our Sunday phone calls, framed it as a side investment, something a friend was managing while Tyler kept his day job. I hadn't asked many questions. I wish I had. It turned out Tyler was the primary investor. He'd put in his own money, borrowed from 2 private investors, and taken out a business loan against the equity in his house. The restaurant had been bleeding money from the beginning, a combination of high rent, inexperienced staff, and a menu that Amber admitted, somewhat reluctantly, nobody in Ashland seemed to want at those prices. They needed an infusion of cash to make it through the slow winter season. They had projections showing a profitable spring if they could just stay afloat until March. "How much?" I said. "Because that's always the question, isn't it?" Tyler looked at Amber. Amber opened the folder. $180,000. I picked my spoon back up and finished my chili. I needed a moment. Then I asked them to leave the folder and said I'd think about it. Tyler said they needed an answer by the end of the week because payroll and February rent were both coming due. I said I understood. I walked them to the door, watched the leased SUV pull out of my driveway, and then I sat at Patricia's kitchen table for a long time in the quiet. $180,000 was not a sum that would ruin me, but it was a sum that would significantly change my situation. After Patricia's life insurance, after the pension from 31 years at the fire district, after selling the small cabin we'd owned up near Klamath Lake because I couldn't go there alone, I had a little over $300,000 in accessible savings and another $200,000 in retirement accounts I couldn't touch for 2 years without a tax penalty. Tyler knew this because we'd talked about it openly after Patricia died, when I'd updated my will and walked him through where everything was. He'd been grateful then, attentive. I remembered thinking it was good that he and I had that kind of honesty between us. Now I was reconsidering what that honesty had actually been for. I didn't sleep. Instead, I did something I'd gotten very good at over 31 years of incident command. I gathered information before I made a decision. First, I called a buddy of mine from the firehouse, Dennis, who had retired 2 years before me and opened a small barbecue catering business. I asked him what his first-year startup costs had looked like. He laughed and said he'd spent $11,000 in year one, including equipment, licensing, insurance, and a truck wrap. He asked why I was asking. I told him I was just curious. I wasn't ready to share yet. Then I looked up the restaurant online. It had a website and about 40 reviews on Yelp, mostly 3s, a few 2s, 2 5s that read like they'd been written by Amber. The photos looked nice. The prices looked ambitious. The most recent review was from 6 weeks ago, which usually means a place isn't doing enough business to generate new reviews. Then I called my old colleague Reyes, who'd gone into commercial real estate after leaving the department. I asked him about restaurant leases in downtown Ashland. He said a decent-sized space there would run between $8,000 and $12,000 a month. He asked if I was thinking of opening something. I said no, just helping a friend think something through. By 2 in the morning, I'd done enough math to understand the situation. The numbers Tyler and Amber had brought in that folder assumed revenue projections that a restaurant with 40 Yelp reviews over 8 months had no business projecting. The $180,000 wasn't a bridge to profitability. It was a delay of the inevitable. And there was something else nagging at me that I couldn't quite name yet. I called Tyler on Wednesday. I told him I'd been thinking carefully and I wanted to meet again before I gave him an answer. I asked him to bring bank statements for the restaurant, the original business loan documents, and the lease agreement. He hesitated in a way that told me a great deal. He said those were just paperwork, that this was a matter of trust, that I was his father, and he shouldn't have to prove himself to me. I told him calmly that I wasn't asking him to prove anything. I was asking to see documentation the way any reasonable person would before committing that kind of money. I told him I'd done the same thing when we refinanced the house 20 years ago. I asked him if he had the documents or not. He said he'd have to pull them together. He'd bring them Saturday. Saturday came. Tyler arrived alone. No Amber. He had a manila envelope with him. I made coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table. He handed me the envelope without making eye contact. The lease was real. The business loan was real. But the bank statements told a different story than the spreadsheet Amber had presented the previous Sunday. The restaurant's business account showed a pattern that wasn't consistent with a cash flow problem caused by a slow season. It was consistent with a business that had never been viable. And more importantly, it showed a series of transfers out of the business account into what appeared to be a personal account. Small amounts, a few hundred here, 1,000 there, spread out over several months. I looked at my son across the table. I knew that face. I'd known it since he was 4 years old and told me he hadn't touched the paint he'd clearly been painting with. I asked him directly, "Tyler, what is the money actually for?" The silence lasted long enough that I had my answer before he spoke. It came out in pieces, the way confessions usually do when someone has been holding a story in too long. The restaurant was real, but it was already past saving, and Tyler knew it. The 8 months had burned through his personal savings, his home equity loan, and most of Amber's parents' retirement contribution, which they'd given willingly and which Tyler hadn't told me about. There were credit cards, too, lines of credit. A personal loan from an old college friend who was now threatening to take legal action. The total debt picture, when Tyler finally laid it out on my kitchen table like a crime scene, was closer to $300,000. The restaurant was just the most recent and most visible piece of it. When did this start? I asked. He rubbed the back of his neck. Honestly, Dad, a long time ago. Right after we got married. We just kind of kept pushing the ceiling up. Every time we hit a limit, we found another way to extend the limit. Did Amber know everything? He looked at the table. Most of it, not all of it. I thought about Patricia, about the 2 jobs she'd worked the year Tyler was in high school so we could help him with college. About the vacation we'd postponed 3 years in a row because we were putting money aside for his future. I thought about the look on her face the day he graduated, how she'd grabbed my arm so tight I could feel her shaking with pride. And then I thought about my son, sitting across from me now, asking me to hand over the money we'd saved across a lifetime so that he could go on not dealing with consequences for a little while longer. I am not angry at you, I said, but I am not giving you this money. His head came up fast. I need you to hear me carefully, I continued. I'm not saying no because I don't love you. I'm saying no because if I give you $180,000 and it buys you 6 months, you will be back here in 6 months asking for more. The restaurant will still fail. The debt will still be there. And I will have spent my retirement fund and you will have learned exactly nothing. That's not help, Tyler. That's just a longer fall. He tried several angles. He told me Patricia would have helped. I told him his mother would have cried and held him and told him she loved him. And then she would have told him no, because Patricia was smart and she loved him enough to want him to be strong. He told me I was choosing money over family. I told him that was not a sentence that meant what he thought it meant. He told me Amber was threatening to leave if they lost the house. I said that was between him and Amber, and I was very sorry to hear it, but it wasn't a reason to give him money that would only delay that conversation. He left without the money. He didn't slam the door. He just left, and the house was very quiet afterward. That night, I called my younger sister, Donna, who lived in Bend, and had always been the clearest thinker in the family. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I'd always loved about her. When I finished, she said, "Jimmy, you did the right thing." Then she said, "Are you okay?" And I realized I wasn't entirely sure. What I was sure about was that I wasn't done, because the following morning I received a voicemail from Tyler that was different from anything he'd said to my face. It was longer, more structured. He talked about how I'd let him down. He talked about all the things he and Amber had given up to be near me after Patricia died. He talked about how he'd always assumed the house would eventually come to him, and that knowing I was sitting on assets he'd need someday made the current situation feel like I was being deliberately cruel. Then at the end, very quietly, he said that if I wasn't willing to help him voluntarily, he'd spoken to someone who said there might be legal avenues to protect a family member from making poor financial decisions in the years following a major bereavement. I listened to that voicemail twice. Then I called my attorney. Her name was Sandra Webb, and she'd handled Patricia's estate. I'd known her for a decade and trusted her judgment completely. I went to her office the next morning and played her the voicemail. She listened with her hands folded on her desk. When it finished, she looked at me over her glasses and said, "He's suggesting a conservatorship or incompetency claim. It won't go anywhere, but the process itself can be disruptive and unpleasant. Let's make sure there's nothing for it to grab onto." We spent the following week restructuring everything. My house, which I owned free and clear, went into a revocable living trust with Sandra as trustee and my sister Donna as successor. My savings accounts were moved to a new institution. My retirement accounts had their beneficiary designations updated to reflect a charitable organization that Patricia and I had discussed years ago, a local hospice that had cared for her in her final weeks. My will was rewritten. Tyler was not excluded from it, but his inheritance was conditional. 5 consecutive years of demonstrated financial stability, verified by a certified financial counselor, before any assets could be transferred. If those conditions weren't met within 15 years, everything went to the hospice and to a scholarship fund at the community college where Patricia had taken art classes on Saturday mornings. Sandra said, "Are you sure about this? Not about the legal structure, which is sound. I mean the decision itself." I told her I'd never been more sure of anything since the day I walked into a burning warehouse on Harbor Street and pulled a man out who hadn't even known he was in trouble yet. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is go in anyway. I had the locks rekeyed. I called Donna and told her I was coming to Bend for an extended stay. She said her spare room had been waiting for me for 3 years. I packed what I needed, which turned out to be considerably less than I'd expected, loaded my tools and my woodworking equipment into the truck, arranged for a property management company to handle the house, and left the white envelope taped to the front door. Inside the envelope was a single typed letter. It told Tyler what I'd done and why. It told him I loved him. It told him that nothing I had done was designed to punish him, only to stop enabling a pattern that was going to destroy him if somebody didn't interrupt it. It told him that the door between us was not closed, but that I would not be opening it by writing checks. It ended with the name and number of a credit counseling nonprofit in Ashland that I'd looked up, along with the number for a therapist who specialized in financial anxiety and couples in crisis. Then I drove north on I-5 with the windows down and the mountains on my right, and for the first time in longer than I could honestly remember, I felt like I was moving towards something instead of waiting for something to hit me. Bend was different from Medford. Smaller in some ways, livelier in others. Donna's neighborhood had a walking trail that ran along the Deschutes River, and I took it every morning, which was something I'd been meaning to do for years and never had time for. I set up my tools in Donna's garage with her permission and started working on a rocking chair I'd had the plans for since before Patricia died. The wood was cherry. Patricia had always said she wanted a cherry rocking chair for the porch. I was going to build it anyway. Tyler called 3 times in the first 2 weeks. I didn't answer. I wasn't ready, and I'd learned enough about fire behavior to know that sometimes you need to let a blaze burn down before you can safely enter. I sent him a text after the 3rd call that said, "I'm well. I'm not ready to talk yet. I'll call you when I am." He responded with a single period, which told me he'd read it and had nothing else to say. The call I wasn't expecting came from Amber, 2 weeks after I'd left Medford. Her voice was different from every previous time we'd spoken. No polish, no positioning, just tired. She said, "James, I think I owe you an apology. I wasn't sure what to do with that, so I just said, 'I'm listening.'" She said she'd been going through everything since I'd said no. The actual numbers, the actual picture. She said Tyler had been managing the information she received in a way she now recognized as controlling. She hadn't known about the loan from his college friend. She hadn't known the full extent of the credit card debt. She'd known things were tight, but she hadn't known they were catastrophically compromised. She said she'd believed the restaurant projections because Tyler had built them, and she'd wanted to believe him. She said, "I think we enabled each other, honestly. I like nice things. I always have." Tyler knew that, and I think he kept finding ways to give me what I wanted because he was afraid of what would happen if he couldn't, and I let him. I didn't look too closely because the life looked right even when it wasn't. I asked her how things stood between them. She said she didn't know. She said Tyler was in a bad place and she wasn't sure if they could come back from the amount of dishonesty that had accumulated, but she was trying. She said he'd agreed to see a counselor, and that he'd started going alone first, which the counselor had apparently suggested. I told her I appreciated her calling. I meant it. After we hung up, I sat on Donna's porch and watched the sky over the Cascades go purple at the edges. I thought about the years Patricia and I had spent building something together. The early years when there was never quite enough. When we drove a car with a cracked exhaust manifold for 18 months because we couldn't afford to fix it. When our vacations were camping trips, because camping was what we could do. I thought about how neither of us had ever thought of those years as deprivation. We'd thought of them as building. That was what I wanted for Tyler. Not punishment, building. My brother-in-law, Frank, Donna's husband, was a retired high school shop teacher who'd spent decades teaching kids that the only way to know if a joint was strong was to put weight on it. He and I worked in the garage together some evenings, him on a cabinet he was refinishing, me on the cherry rocking chair. We didn't talk a lot. We didn't need to. It was the kind of companionship I hadn't known I was missing. Frank said one night without looking up from what he was doing, "Donna told me about your boy." I said yes. He said, "I had a student once, brilliant kid, could build anything. His parents did everything for him, fixed every mistake before he even knew he'd made it." I asked Frank what happened to him. He said he got to be about 35 and realized he didn't know how to do anything on his own. Almost destroyed him. Then he said, "Some kids need to fall. Not because falling is good, because getting up is." I didn't say anything. but I held on to it. The restaurant closed in December, 6 weeks after I'd left Medford. Tyler texted me a one-sentence message about it. I responded that I was sorry and that I hoped he was taking care of himself. He didn't reply. Sandra forwarded me a letter she'd received from an attorney representing Tyler, challenging the trust structure on the grounds that I'd acted under duress and without sound mind following Patricia's death. Sandra's response was 4 pages long, documented, and airtight. I'd passed a voluntary cognitive assessment the week after the restructuring. The challenge went nowhere. I heard from Tyler's college friend through a mutual acquaintance that Tyler had agreed to a repayment plan on the personal loan. It wasn't much, $50 a month to start, but it was something. The restaurant investors were being negotiated with separately. The house in Ashland was listed for sale in January. Christmas was quiet. Donna and Frank had their daughter's family over, grandchildren filling the house with noise. I made cookies from Patricia's recipe and felt her presence in the kitchen like a warm current, not sad exactly, just present. I called Donna's grandchildren by the wrong names at least 3 times, and was corrected with great seriousness each time, which made me laugh more than I'd laughed in months. Tyler did not call on Christmas. He called in February, on a Thursday afternoon when I was in the garage putting the final finish coat on the rocking chair. I almost let it go to voicemail out of habit. Then I answered, "Dad, Tyler." The silence lasted long enough that I could hear him breathing, and then he said, "I don't even know how to start this." I said, "Start wherever you are right now." He started in the middle and worked outward, which was the most honest way to do it. The restaurant was gone. The house had sold for less than what was owed, but enough to eliminate most of the mortgage. He and Amber were renting a 2-bedroom apartment in Medford. He'd been let go from his sales director position during a company reorganization in November, which he hadn't told me because he hadn't told anyone, and he'd been working since January as an account rep for a small medical supply company, a significant step down in title, a reduction in pay, and the first time in 6 years he'd been in a role where nobody was managing anyone other than himself. He said it was humbling. He said that was probably not a strong enough word. He'd started seeing a therapist in October and a financial counselor in December. He said the financial counselor had assigned him homework that included writing down every purchase above $20 in a notebook by hand, daily. He said it was the most uncomfortable thing he'd ever done. He said the first 2 weeks of looking at that notebook made him feel like someone was showing him a photograph of himself he didn't recognize. "Dad," he said, "I'm not calling to ask for anything." "I know," I said. "I'm calling because my therapist told me I had to decide whether I was going to keep being angry at you or whether I was going to try to understand what you actually did and why. And I spent about 3 months just being angry. And then I spent about a month just being ashamed. And now I'm somewhere on the other side of that, where I'm trying to be honest." I asked him what honest looked like right now. He said, "Honest looks like I understand why you said no. I don't just mean I get it intellectually. I mean I actually understand it now in my body, the way you understand something when you've lived it. You would have given me money that I would have burned through in 6 months, and I would have come back for more, and I would have blamed you when it didn't save me, and I would have taken from you what Patricia and you spent your whole lives building. And you didn't let me do that to either of us." Neither of us said anything for a moment. He said, "I was so angry that morning when I found the locks changed. I sat on that porch for I don't know how long. Carol came out at some point and asked if I was okay. I told her to mind her own business, which I'm embarrassed about now. I told him Carol was a resilient woman. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. He asked how I was doing. I told him about Bend, about the river trail, about the rocking chair. He asked if Patricia had ever seen the plans for it. I told him no. She'd described what she wanted years ago, and I'd sketched it out later, when I was ready. He said that sounded like something she would have loved. I said I thought so too. It was a small exchange, but it was the first one in months that felt like us. Before we hung up, he asked if there was any possibility of seeing me sometime. "Not right away," he said quickly. "I know there's a lot to rebuild, but sometime, when it makes sense." I said yes. When it makes sense. Spring came to Bend like it always does, aggressively and without apology. The river trail got crowded with joggers and dog walkers and young couples pushing strollers. I walked it every morning anyway, early enough to have it mostly to myself. I found a woodworking group that met on Tuesday evenings at a community space downtown, mostly retirees. One woman who'd been a carpenter for 30 years and could do things with a dovetail joint that made Frank's eyes go wide when I described them. I brought the rocking chair to the first meeting I attended as a finished piece, just to have something to show. The woman, whose name was Eleanor, turned it over in her hands and nodded slowly and said I had good bones. I told her that was the nicest thing anyone had said to me in recent memory. I started making furniture with intention for the first time. Not just hobby work, but pieces I designed, pieces with specific proportions and specific purposes. Eleanor helped me improve my joinery. Frank and I built a workbench together that occupied most of one wall of Donna's garage and became the center of our shared evening routine. I sold 2 pieces through a local antique shop and put the money aside without spending it for 3 weeks, just to feel what it was like to earn something with my hands again. Sandra called in April to let me know that all legal challenges to the trust had been formally withdrawn. She said Tyler's attorney had submitted a letter acknowledging that the restructuring had been carried out competently and in good faith. She said she thought that letter had probably cost Tyler something to agree to, and she said it in a way that was kind rather than clinical. I thought about calling him that evening but decided to wait. Some things need more time than you want to give them. In May, I found a small rental house in a neighborhood near the river, a place that was old enough to need work and had a detached garage that would become a proper workshop. The landlord, a quiet man named Harold, who ran a fly fishing shop on the main street, shook my hand at the end of the walkthrough and said the place had been waiting for someone who would take care of it rather than just live in it. I told him I'd do my best. He said that was all the house needed. I moved my tools in before I moved myself in. The garage came first. Tyler called in June to say he'd been promoted at the medical supply company to senior account manager. It wasn't the title he'd had before. The pay was still less than it had been at the peak, but he said it in a tone I hadn't heard from him in years, the tone of someone who'd actually done something and knew the weight of it. I told him I was genuinely proud of him. I meant that more than most things I'd said in a long time. He asked if the invitation to visit still stood. I said I'd just moved into a place with a guest room that needed furniture, and maybe he could help me pick it out. He arrived on a Saturday morning in July, driving a 4-year-old Honda Civic that belonged to Amber, because they were sharing one car now. He looked different, quieter in a way that wasn't defeat, more like someone who had stopped performing and started just being. We shook hands in the driveway and then I pulled him in, and held on for longer than either of us expected. We spent most of the first day just moving around each other in the house, talking about practical things, what furniture the guest room needed, whether the front porch boards were salvageable or needed replacing. I showed him the workshop, and he ran his hands along the workbench the way I used to watch him run his hands along things when he was small and figuring the world out. He picked up a spokeshave and turned it over. I showed him what it was for. He said he never knew I was this good at this. I told him I'd been practicing. That evening, we grilled on the back porch and watched the light change over the Cascades. Tyler talked about his financial counseling, about the notebook that had started as homework and become a habit, about the difference between wanting a thing and being able to afford it, which he said he'd finally started to feel in his body instead of just his head. He said Amber was doing her own counseling work and that their marriage was somewhere between uncertain and possible, which he thought was an honest place to be. I asked him what he wanted his life to look like, not in 10 years, just right now. He thought about it for a while. He said, simpler, realer. He said he'd spent so long trying to look like someone successful that he'd never figured out what he actually wanted from the being alive part. He said the strangest moment in the last 8 months was the first day he'd taken the bus to work because they were sharing the car and he'd had 40 minutes with nothing to do but look out the window. And he'd realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd had 40 minutes with nothing to do but look out the window. And it had been the best 40 minutes he'd had in years. I told him his mother would have loved that. He said he knew. On Sunday morning, I drove him to the Deschutes, and we walked the trail I'd been walking every day for months. He asked questions about the river, about the town, about whether I was happy here. I told him I was getting to something like happy, which was farther than I'd gotten in a long time. He said that was good. He said it in a way that I believed. Before he left, standing by the Civic in the driveway, he reached into his jacket and handed me an envelope. I started to say something. He shook his head. "It's $300, he said. "I know that's nothing compared to everything. But it's 3 months of setting aside $100 a month from my own paycheck. I'm not paying you back. That's not what this is. This is me proving to myself that I can build something and give instead of just take." I held the envelope for a moment. I thought about the cherry rocking chair on my porch. I thought about Patricia in her garden with the coffee going cold. I thought about a man I'd pulled out of a burning building 20 years ago, who had sent me a card every Christmas since, and how he'd written in the first one that the best thing I'd ever done for him was not leave him there. I thanked my son and told him I'd put it to good use. I deposited the check the following week and made a matching donation to the Rogue Valley Hospice that had cared for Patricia. $300 in memory of a woman who had believed, until the end, that the people she loved were capable of becoming who they were meant to be. She was right. She was just patient enough to wait for it. Autumn came back around and Tyler drove up again, this time with Amber. It was the first time I'd seen her since before everything had happened. She was quieter than I remembered, steadier. She brought a homemade pie and apologized for things she didn't have to apologize for but wanted to. I told her none of us had been at our best and that we were all just trying to figure out how to be better. She nodded and seemed to mean it. We ate dinner at the table I'd built over the summer, a big farmhouse piece in white oak that seated 6 comfortably. Tyler ran his hand along the edge and said, "Did you make this?" I said yes. He said it was the most beautiful table he'd ever eaten at. I said that was because he'd eaten it with people instead of for an audience, and that made a difference. After dinner, he helped me carry the cherry rocking chair from the workshop to the front porch, where it had been sitting in pieces waiting for the right moment. He steadied it while I checked the level. We stood back and looked at it. He didn't know about his mother's description, about the years that had gone into the idea of it. I told him then, standing on that porch in the October air, about the conversation Patricia and I had had on a camping trip in the Wallawas when he was maybe 8 years old, about her sitting on a log by the fire and saying, "Someday, when we're old, I want a rocking chair on a porch where I can see the mountains and just sit." I told him it had taken me a few years longer than I'd planned to build it. He was very quiet for a moment, then he said, "She would have sat in it every single day." "I know," I said. He put his arm around my shoulder and we stood there while Amber took a photo from the doorway and the mountains in the distance caught the last of the day's light. I thought about everything the year had cost us, what it had broken and what it had forced into being. I thought about fire, which destroys and also clears, which takes what was and makes room for what comes next. I'd spent 31 years walking into what other people were walking away from. I'd done it because the job asked it of me, and because I'd believed that sometimes the most important thing a person could do was go toward the hard thing instead of away from it. Saying no to my son had been the hardest thing I'd done since Patricia died. Harder than I'd expected, harder than it looked from the outside. But sitting on the porch that October evening in a chair I'd built with my own hands, with the mountains I'd always loved in the distance, and the sound of my son's voice carrying out from inside the house where he was helping Amber clean up the dishes, I understood something I hadn't been able to put words to until now. Love that enables is not love. It's fear wearing love's face. Real love tells the truth, even when the truth is expensive. Real love lets the people it cares for feel the weight of the world instead of lifting it away, because that weight is how they become strong enough to carry their own lives. Patricia knew that. She'd tried to teach it to both of us when she was alive. I just needed time, and a burning building, and a locked door, to finally learn it for myself. The rocking chair sits on my porch. On clear mornings I bring my coffee out and watch the light come over the mountains and think about Patricia in her garden on that last Tuesday in March. I don't think she suffered. I've chosen to believe that too. I think she sat in her garden and watched the light change, the way she always loved to, and then she went quietly the way she'd always wanted to go, without fuss, without asking anything of anyone. I think if she could have chosen her last site, it would have been exactly that. Early morning, coffee, mountains, the day just beginning. I sit in her rocking chair, and I try to see it the way she would have seen it. Some mornings I almost can.